Hello, this is Eric. Today is January the 19th, 2023. And in this video, we'll be talking about the Nativist and Emancipation Uprisings in Brazil, in colonial Brazil. Right? So, along the past few classes, we've been covering the sugarcane cycle and the gold mining cycle. And these nativist and emancipation uprisings took place along these two cycles. We have already talked about some of these uprisings, but now we're going to summarize them all. We are going to cover all of them. And through that, you'll be able to have a broader image of the scenario during these two cycles, okay? So here you have a picture illustrating the violence and cruelty that was being practiced by Portugal against any rioter during these two periods, okay? So the nativist uprisings, what we must understand is that these uprisings, they did not aim to end the colonial pact. Basically, the settlers, they were dissatisfied with some points of the colonial pact, with some points of the colonial pact, and they just wanted to talk to Portugal. They just wanted to see things being improved, right? So the most important uprisings were the Backham Riot in 1684. We're going to be discussing about this today. The Peddlers' War, we have already covered, right? These two were, they basically took place during the sugarcane cycle. And then we have the Outsiders' War. I don't know if you remember that, but when we were talking about the gold cycle, we covered this one. The Trailblazers went inland after, they were not necessary to help the northeastern coast with indigenous peoples being resold as slaves. So they went inland after gold and they found it. As soon as the news were spread, the Portuguese and other European immigrants started to go inland as well. And, well, obviously, as you can imagine, there were battles between these two groups. And basically, this is what we covered concerning the Outsiders' War during this period from 1707 to 1709. And finally, we have the Felipe dos Santos riots, which we're going to be covering today. Basically, these two last riots, they took place during the gold mining cycle, okay? So what was the Backham riot? It was provoked due to the dissatisfaction regarding the slave labor. Why? The Dutch had been expelled from Brazil, right? And that happened during the Iberian Union. So what they did, basically, they went to the Antilles, right? And they began to produce high-quality sugarcane. And that caused Portugal to lose a lot of money. And consequently, that caused a lot of loss of money to the sugarcane mill owners in Brazil, right? Also, the Dutch took control of the African slave trade. And as you can imagine, buying an African slave became, after this, very expensive. And, these settlers, they were losing money because the Dutch had been, they started to control the sugarcane market. So, what basically happened is that, the Trailblazers, they were contacted and they began to go inland to hunt for indigenous peoples, right? And that's where the problem begins, because the Jesuits, they were against the indigenous slavery. And they were constantly resorting to the Catholic Church. And as a consequence, a law was enacted on April 1st, 1680, which prohibited the enslavement of indigenous peoples. Well, Trailblazers and these owners, right, of sugar mills, they did not feel happy about that. And a riot started on February 24th, right? So the rebels took control of São Luís until 1685, right? And the problem, and we got to go here in further detail, right? So basically, what we had was Manuel Beckham. That's why you have the name Beckham, right? We have these two leaders, Manuel Beckham and Thomas Beckham, right? They were Portuguese, and they became known for their involvement in the uprising, right? So the rebellion began when armed men managed to surrender the guards who were staying at the Estanco house, right? The place where the company, this company that we had already discussed in previous classes, where the company bought and sold goods. Then they occupied strategic sites of São Luís and imprisoned the captain major, the governor's representative. So after the riots began, and the rebels, they did the best out of, the possibilities they had. They formed a provisional government known as a General Board of Government, right? So then we had, and by the way, the company I was talking about was the Maranhão Trade Company, right? So basically, during this provisional government, they removed the governor of Maranhão, which, by the way, lived in an area in the region of Belém, and this region was not seen in a positive manner by São Luís at the time, right? So they removed this governor, they closed the Maranhão Trade Company, and they banished the Jesuits, right? However, the regions in the outskirts, the regions near São Luís, they did not adhere to the movement. So along the time, the movement lost its strength and was defeated by the Portuguese crown. Right? Manuel Beckham and Jorge de Sampaio were sentenced and executed in 1695. Okay, so here you have a picture of the Beckham riot. And then we have, already in the gold mining cycle, the Felipe dos Santos riot, right? So basically, what we gotta understand here is that these foundry houses, they transformed gold in a way that could be carried to Europe, and they were involved with abuse of power because of the way that the Portuguese crown used it, to tax all the mining owners, right? The miners, actually. And, as I told you, abusive tax and dissatisfaction was going on concerning the colonial pact. So the Portuguese, they were really, really ruthless. They charged high and abusive taxes, right? In our previous class, we discussed that in detail, so I'm not going to say it all again. But in this occasion, actually, let me see just one thing. It was around, so the foundry houses, they started more or less in 1719, right? And in 1720, this crowd of about 2,000 people from Vila Rica, they broke into the house of one of the assistants of the governor and went to Vila do Carmo, which is currently the Mariana city here. If you don't remember, a few years ago, we had this ecological disaster in the city of Mariana, right? And Vila Rica is really the same region. And they went there to demand from the governor, right, the end of the foundry houses and the decrease in the commercial taxes. So when the governor received, imagine you receiving 2,000 people demanding the same thing. So he went like, okay, I'm going to talk to Portugal and see what I can do for you. But he told, he basically said that because he wanted to gain time. So he contacted the Portuguese, and the Portuguese sent troops, right? And these troops repressed the participants of the movement. So several miners were arrested, including Felipe dos Santos, who was the most famous one and one of the leaders. And he was basically sentenced to death, right? The Portuguese crown dismembered the region of Minas Gerais from the captaincy of São Paulo, because they realized it would be better to look after Minas Gerais isolated from São Paulo, right? And then here's another picture, this one concerning the Felipe dos Santos riot, right? And then we have the Emancipation Uprisings. The first one, the most important one actually, was the Minas Gerais in Confidence, which we covered in our previous class. If you haven't seen it, please access it here in my channel and watch it, right? But basically, here we have a change of scenario. People are definitely not happy with Portugal, and they want to see Brazil independent from Portugal, or at least the region of Minas Gerais in this case, because that's what we learned from our previous class, because Tiradentes and the others, they were not interested in making all of the country independent. They wanted to establish a republic covering only the area of Minas Gerais, right? But in some cases, as you're going to see, they really wanted the entire country becoming independent from Portugal. And that's basically based on the same reasons that I had addressed in the previous nativist uprisings. High taxes collected from Portugal and Brazil, the abusive colonial pact, right? Brazil could only maintain commercial relations with Portugal. We have privileges that the Portuguese had in the colony in relation to the Brazilians, unjust laws created by the Portuguese crown, which have to be followed by the Brazilians. So after the Minas Gerais in Confidence, a few years later, we had the Bahia Conjuration, or as it was popularly known at the time, the Shoeshine Man riot. So basically, it took place because of the high prices and lack of foods in the region, dissatisfaction with Portugal's dominance in Brazil, and they wanted the emancipation of Brazil, the establishment of a republic, and freedom of trade. You see that, naming the republic as a solution was really, really something that was on high at the time, because we had like simultaneously with these uprisings, the independence of the USA, the French Revolution, and all of that. So basically, you can see here that this idea of republic was already very strong in the minds of the rioters of the time. They also wanted higher salaries for soldiers. And in this case, they wanted the abolition or the abolishment of slavery and privileges, right? So you have here a picture of this square that is called Piedade Square. Unfortunately, the leaders, Cipriano Barata, that was a philosopher, Luiz Gonzaga das Virgens, Manuel Faustino dos Santos Lira, and João Deus do Nascimento, these were shoeshine men, right? Unfortunately, they all ended up having problems because blacksmith José da Veiga denounced the movement, just like we had seen in the Minas Gerais in Confidence, right? And many rioters were arrested. Some were expelled from Brazil, and 4 of them, including one Catholic father, were executed in the Piedade Square, right? And finally, we have the Pernambuco Revolution, right? This one took place after the gold cycle. Actually, we are going to see that in our next class. The royal Portuguese family had already gone to Brazil, right? So they are already here in Brazil. And because of that, they are going to be really, really abusive concerning taxes and concerning a lot of other things that we'll be studying in our next class in relation to the Brazilian people. And that really made everyone in Brazil go angry, get angry with them, right? So other nations were becoming independent in America and establishing republics. So the people in Brazil, they were seeing that. And Dom Juan VI, he reinforced the Portuguese presence in the command posts of local governments and heads of military troops. And in this revolution, the leaders were Domingo José Martins, José de Barros Lima, Cabujá Cruz, and Father João Ribeiro, right? The rioters defended. Take a look at what they defended. The proclamation of the Republic, and by the way, sorry, I made a confusion here. In the Bahia Conjuration, there was not a Catholic father being killed, right? Just the other participants I mentioned. There was a Catholic father involved in this revolution here. I'm sorry, so, well, it's already corrected here. So the rioters defended basically the proclamation of the Republic, the end of the taxes charged by Dom João VI, freedom of press and worship. Yeah, we had lots of religions here in Brazil, and they were oppressed here. They were not allowed to manifest themselves freely. The increase in the soldiers' wages again, the institution of the three powers, executive, legislative, and judiciary, and the maintenance of the slave labor. So these guys, this revolution actually was not promoted by the poor people. It was promoted by the Brazilian elite, right? And they wanted slave labor to continue. And the poorest layer of people did not participate in the revolution. This is very important to say. Well, as you probably can imagine, let me just detail it a little more so you may understand what happened. So the Broom Fort was the government of the captaincy of Pernambuco, while the participants of the Pernambucan Revolution occupied power in Recife. So the Pernambuco Revolution began on March 6, 1817. When the Portuguese military Manuel Joaquim Barbosa was murdered by Captain José de Barros Lima, who reacted to the prison command for alleged involvement in conspiracy against the government. And then, this was like the fuse for the rebellion that quickly dominated Recife. Right? This is important. The government of the captaincy, Caetano Pinto de Miranda Montenegro, transferred the government to the Broom Fort. Without the strength to react to the uprising, he fled towards Rio de Janeiro. So the rebels assumed the power of the captaincy and installed a provisional government, which immediately tried to adopt measures to benefit the local elite. So they didn't really care about the poor people. The last item of the claims of the participants of this revolution shows that the poorest layer, they did not really participate in the activities. So there was a contradiction between the discourse, the speech, and the practice, because they said they cared about the poor layer of the people, but actually they only sought after the elite interests. Right? So the rioters took power in Pernambuco and formed a provisional government, right? And we had the Magna date in Pernambuco, March 6th. That is a holiday because it recalls a day when in 1817 the revolution against the Portuguese dominance and the installation of a republic government in the region began. It had just a short duration, actually, only 75 days. Right, the movement left roots in the history of Pernambuco and confirmed the captaincy as a place of riot against the dominance. And, well, basically what we had there is that, this riot was controlled with might, by Don Juan VI's soldiers. The rioters were cruelly executed in a public square. And from this moment on, the Portuguese crown and also the first reign, because Brazil would become independent just a few years later, the first reign and already the Portuguese crown, they really realized that they needed to create military troops to maintain national unity, because this is the second time that there was a uprising, and it took a long and harsh struggle from the Portuguese to defeat it. You know, in most cases, they had to hire experts in combat, you know, to defeat these revolutions. So the Portuguese didn't really had an army with troops to maintain this national unity. You see that there's a lot of people in the country that wants, you know, to Brazil to be, you know, at least their own regions to be separate from the Portuguese crown. But the Portuguese crown was interested in maintaining the national unity. So they really realized that they needed military troops to maintain national unity. And they, from this revolution, they began to invest in it and to severely punish the rebels, right? Well, this is a picture from the Pernambuco uprising. And that's it. Okay, thank you so much. In our next class, we're going to be talking about the royal family coming to Brazil. See you.